Hi, I'm Jody, a relationship and sex therapist based in Southern California, and today we're going to be reviewing the book We Are All Neurodiverse: How to Build a Neurodiversity Affirming Future and Challenge Neuronormativity by Sonny Jane Wise. This book was an interesting one. I had actually never heard of it, even though I'm not the most informed on all neurodiversity resources, but I have been kind of exploring the space for a while, and I found some other books, but this is actually one that came to me through a book club that I'm in, and I was like, oh, what is this? This one would have been great to have found earlier in my exploration of neurodiversity, but I do think that it is a great resource for people that are really starting to process and explore what neurodiversity is. As you can kind of tell by the title, even the term "We Are All Neurodiverse," that was one thing that I definitely took from this book, was differentiating between the terms neurodiverse and neurodivergent. And these are still kind of words that tend to kind of appease the general population in identifying things as different, when the whole basis of the book is to normalize the natural diversity of the brain. But the main thing was, they're saying that we're all neurodiverse, right? We're all diverse. That encompasses everybody, right? So you wouldn't say that, oh, I'm neurodiverse too, which is maybe something I used to say. It's actually, I'm neurodivergent, which just means that I tend to stray from what is considered, normal. And even that word is not really the appropriate word that we're looking to use there, but basically what a person would expect, how we would function. Oh, you just do a task. No, not that easy, right? Maybe we, need different accommodations or other things, and that makes sense, and that is okay. That is expected. It is not expected that we're all going to function exactly the same. I'm not an artist, right? I'm never going to be an artist. It is not a skill set that I have. Somebody else, we don't pathologize, right? Another person being better at art than I am. We just accept that's a normal divergence of skill sets, interests, things like that. We don't go around and say, hey, why are you not good at art? Why are you not super creative? What's wrong with you? And so it's kind of bringing in that same idea of, where do these even definitions come from? Who decided this? Which there are sections of the book where they talk about that, and the DSM, which is, for those of you that aren't therapists or aren't familiar, that is the diagnostic manual that a lot of therapists and healthcare providers use to diagnose mental health conditions. We've had ones in there that have been very outdated, like being gay used to be in there, and they finally got rid of that. They're like, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. They go into the history of where the DSM came from, and it kind of being really fueled by insurance companies, capitalism, all these things to justify why someone needs care and to pathologize things. And so they're really kind of trying to debunk. That'll be really interesting to see the direction that things go in the future. But that was one of the things that they talked about. Like I said, they kind of put between neurodiverse and neurodivergent. They talked about the different diagnoses and expanding the definition. I feel like a lot of people, they think of autism and ADHD as what neurodivergent means, when in actuality it can include a bunch of different things. It could be traumatic. Somebody had a traumatic brain injury. They included Down syndrome. They even talked about schizophrenia in a portion of the book. And I thought that was all really fascinating and great reflections. OCD. And they differentiate also between innate and acquired, right? Innate is more of genetic factors. We know that if a person has autism or ADHD in their family, they're likely to pass it on to their kids, or if their kids have it, then probably likely some hints that the parents might have some traits like that as well. And again, it's not a disease. It is just, they are just traits, right? Of hey, I've got, my nose or my hair from my family member, that these are the same things. I've got my neurodivergent somatic things from my parents, right? It's the same thing, how our brains work. So I really love the non-pathologizing, depathologizing kind of lens, and how it also talks about social justice factors, types of diversity, and things as well. But yeah, going back to innate is genetic factors, things like that. Acquired are more things that developed past initial stages of development. So for example, you got into an accident, you had a brain injury, you have dementia when you get older, sometimes schizophrenia or other things like that will not develop until you're a young adult. And so just normalizing that there's not necessarily one right or wrong way. There is value maybe having some shared language, because again, I think this is always where we get into this kind of stuck place of, we need to have language so we can all communicate, but that language can also be limiting, right? And we want to know, what does that mean? Right? What's the treatment, right? DSM. Oh, these are the qualifications to meet this diagnosis. How do you treat this? I want to know the answer. Whereas I think this, along with a lot of other topics in our society right now, like gender, sexuality, the answer is, yes, let's have some guidance, but let's not put everything into a box. And so I really enjoyed that piece. It did feel for me a little bit repetitive after a while because I have been on this journey already for a while versus like somebody that's kind of in really the beginning of this. I think that's a little bit different, and it's really kind of makes you think about like, wow, I've been kind of like drinking this Kool-Aid for a while. And I know for me that was part of my journey, and that's why I have a lot of interest because I am diagnosed with ADHD and potentially also on the ADHD spectrum there too. And I've always thought, like, why do I have such a hard time with these things? And doing some of this research, even through my own modes of going through social media, things like that, I really was able to connect with, okay, that explains why I pick at my hands. That explains this and that. And why I wait till the last possible minute to do any school assignments, right? Why I have such a hard time with following through. Why do I sit in a shame spiral watching TV? And some of these things really help me to understand. And so they don't go into a lot of like the tips and tricks as much as some of the other books. This is more of like an informational, kind of helps you to think and change our viewpoints. They do have some examples like I did make a whole list for myself of like wording changes that they suggested. There was a whole part in the back end of the book where they had like accommodations and things for like work or whatever else, and I think those are super useful. They did give some kind of tips and tricks, but it wasn't like, oh, if you struggle with this, do that. Overall, like I said, this book was not so much that I was learning new things. I did learn some new things, but for me, this book was all about affirmation. With neurodivergence, you talk a lot about masking and feeling other and things like that. And I definitely felt that for a really long time. What's wrong with me that I can't do these things, right? And I remember even when I was in grad school for becoming a therapist, I had experiences, it was even after grad school, honestly, where, my brain is naturally innovative. I love to question things. Why is it always done this way? Why am I supposed to do what you tell me to do? And I think that that's really great. Of course, we need to still have some boundaries around, I can't just throw the whole entire rule book out the window, right? I've got to utilize my training and things like that. But I remember there was a lot of pain there where when I would question these things at the time, I was seen as unethical or like I was not a safe therapist, like by other clinicians. It wasn't even clients. Like the clients oftentimes had a positive response. They felt seen. Like I had a schizophrenic client when I was a trainee, and I remember the psychiatrist at that office would say, we don't acknowledge the voices. And it felt very shaming that like I didn't know what I was talking about. And I'll tell you what, that client actually really valued that I was able to bring in like IFS work where we were acknowledging the voices, we were befriending them, we were acknowledging that that was part of that person's experience. Who am I to tell them that what they're experiencing is not real, right? Of course, there's maybe limitations to that, but this whole idea of treating people who come in these different ways, because again, maybe that was a form of neurodiversity for that person, or neurodivergence, that what kind of experience was that for me to invalidate their experience and tell them what was right or wrong, when that wasn't necessarily that experience. And so for me, it was very validating to kind of hear that like, hey, these things I've been thinking for a really long time are actually kind of coming to fruition now and being developed. So I really enjoyed the book. It's a lot of like, it makes you think quite a bit. And so it can be a little bit like cognitive heavy, but overall, I really enjoyed the book. I recommend it. I want to make more neurodivergent content and neurodiversity content. But yeah, if you've read the book or you have any interest, feel free to read it and let me know what you think.